Well, thank you. Thank you for coming out today as well. I get the wonderful job of being your cleanup act. And after all that I've heard since I got here, I got to tell you, you've heard a lot of really important things. I want to talk about, though, a little bit of history, a little bit of hysteria, and then leave with a little bit of hope, because I think that's what we all need to leave here with. But let me first thank Danielle and Roz for putting together an awesome event. So thank you guys for doing this. And just a little reflection on comments from Mr. Wesley, Mr. Kemp, from Ms. Zroliak and others. Just the history that you're getting is all part of a patchwork. We never know our history. Earlier today, somebody said they didn't know about Tulsa until just a few years ago. I didn't know till my 50s. I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but that wasn't that long ago. I didn't know about Tulsa. We buried the history. We buried the past. So you have to ask yourself some questions about why attack education? Why is that where people aim at? So I'm going to give you a little history. How many of you have been watching what's going on in Texas? Anybody? Yeah. Do you know why Texas matters to Alaska? Do you have any idea why? Textbook companies. I just heard a couple people say it. Textbook companies' largest market is Texas. So they go to Texas to see what's going on in terms of policy, and then they make their textbooks look like those books, and then they sell them to us, and they sell them to everyone else. So that's why Texas politics is Alaska politics. So when you see Texas back in the 80s and 90s start to change the Board of Education, the group that manages the selection of textbooks, they're doing it for a reason. By 2012, the Republican Party of Texas actually had a platform plank that called for the banning of critical thinking. Those are the exact words that were in their platform. Banning critical thinking. Now they got called on it 2 years later. They said banning the thought of thinking critically. They changed it a little bit. There's a reason why it's Texas, where they've decided to apply a blanket version of what they call CRT. And let me tell you something about CRT. That's part of the hysteria. CRT, if somebody says to you, what about CRT? They all for sure don't know what they're talking about. That's why they use the initials. It's code word. And the code word, the use of CRT as a code word is to, as Mr. Claymeyer said, is to turn you against your neighbor. It's to bury the discussion of your past. It's to create an overarching thematic that becomes the thematic, that becomes the theme that denies history and presents those of color against those who aren't. The thing that people in power fear most is when the poor, regardless of color, or the disenfranchised, regardless of color, begin to work together. And when that happens, you see certain things happen, like a word or a phrase, CRT, emerges. Why? To divide us, to not let us come together. When we see that power of people working together begins to affect folks, the hysteria takes over. And what happens? You see that people begin to draw more distinctions. You are unlike you. And they tell people that look like me, you can come into the country club. And they tell people who don't look like me, you're not important. That's when you know you're winning. That's when you know you're succeeding. That stuff doesn't happen if they have unthreatened power. That happens when they're threatened. So when I have my colleagues step up on the floor of the Senate and start saying CRT, that tells me, even though I'm in the minority, that just maybe they feel a little threatened. When I see it happen nationally, it tells me maybe they feel a little threatened. Now, y'all know what happened yesterday? Or was it today? Might have been today. Yesterday? Passage of the John Lewis Act nationally on the House side. It's got to pass the Senate. It's got to convince people to support it. Why? Because the reason you dumb down education and you tell people not to teach history is so you make democracy weaker. The foundation of democracy is built on the bedrock of education. And education must be sound. It cannot be weak, or it's like clay. And in the slightest of earthquakes, the foundations crumble. Democracy is threatened when people threaten education. Democracy is threatened when people threaten education. So the hysteria about CRT is about retaining power. It's because power is being threatened. So I want to talk a little bit about hope. And I'm going to bring it home and talk a little bit about what happened in our own state Senate. Now, recently somebody proposed an amendment to the budget that would prohibit any school district that taught critical race theory from receiving funds in our budget. Now, somebody actually proposed that on the floor of our state Senate. Now, here's the thing about it. They didn't have a single bit of an idea of what they were talking about. Because as you saw in Kenai, where teachers testified and the public came up and said, stop teaching CRT, in the Kenai Peninsula, they said, we don't do that. Here, they said just because we wanted to talk about race, that it was somehow critical race theory. Well, that's just a lie. It's a lie. So I stood up and I said something of what Mr. Kemp said. I talked about how this neighborhood, Rogers Park, so many neighborhoods in this town barred Alaska Natives and blacks from being property owners. Up until the 70s, some of those were on the books. We used to have a poll tax here. Essentially, if you couldn't speak the language of English, you couldn't vote. That was actually in our Constitution in Alaska. And how many here knows that there used to be native-only water fountains in southeast and other parts of this state? Native only. This state was fully covered by the Voting Rights Act, and there was a reason for it. Because we discriminated. And you know what? We taught that history in our schools. I learned that history in our schools because it was important for us to know where we came from, so we could know where we might go. Without that, we lose. So I stood up on the floor, and I didn't get mad at my colleague. I said, my colleague's mistaken. She says critical race theory is being taught and that it's dividing us. It's not critical race theory that's dividing us. It's the discussion of critical race theory that's dividing us. I said, in Alaska, we've used the theory that laws might be discriminatory to make better law. And we've succeeded at that. We've created better law by looking to see, is there an impact that affects Alaska Natives or African Americans or any of our immigrant communities here? And if so, what can we do to fix it? Because Alaska has always been at the forefront of defeating racial discrimination when it's been thrust in our face, trying to build a better example for the rest of the country. That's who we are. And you know what my colleagues in the Senate did? They voted down that amendment. They voted it down. And that does deserve a round of applause. And not just a few of them. A supermajority did. And they didn't have to because their handlers told them to vote for it. So, here's the hope. Hope because you know that the reason this is being discussed or that people are going after education is because they are threatened. Hope because you know that the more of us who stand together, the less likely they are to succeed. Hope because it's true. In the end, if we believe that we can build, as Mr. Wesley and Mr. Martinez said, a more perfect union, it's because we acknowledge by saying the words a more perfect union, we already knew we had an imperfect one. And that is the truth of history. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming out and being a part of this. Go to your friends, go to your neighbors, support those who are fighting for you and with you for fairer, better, and more inclusive education. I know that I will. Thank you very much.
Somebody's holy dark days will come.